Okay, hi everybody, come on in, make yourself at home, get comfortable. We're going to be talking about dyslexia today. It's a very important topic, I know, and I really hope we can help a lot of the parents who are here, give you guys some really good information and support and help. I want to just invite you to open up the chat box if you would. And just let us know where you're from and how old your child is. That would be great. And in just a minute, I will introduce Dr. Blank. We're so lucky to have her here today, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. So we'll just let everybody get on. Okay, welcome, Brooklyn. You have an 8-year-old. Okay, that's great. So I'd love to hear from everybody else. If you just have a minute, give us where you're from and how old your child is. That's kind of helpful. Oh, hi, Lisa from New Jersey, grade 3. Thank you so much. That's good. All right, well, welcome. Oh, California, I'm from California too, except I'm in Nevada now, but Indiana, Florida, good. We have a lot of 8-year-olds and 3rd and 4th graders. Oh, someone from California, 5th grade, okay, Canada, welcome, we're glad you're here. You guys are from all over, so we really are happy that you're here tonight. I do want to say that what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce Dr. Blank and Dr. Marion. I'm calling her Dr. Marion now.
That's right, much nicer.
That's better. It's more friendly. And if you have questions, just open up the Q&A box, and you might have questions as we're speaking, which is fine. Oops, let me just get rid of this right now. Get the presentation up. There we go. And if you have questions as we are speaking, just put them in the Q&A box, and we're going to come to your questions at the end. So we're going to go through the whole presentation so you can hear everything, and then backtrack and answer all your questions. And I know that you have questions or you would not be here tonight. So we want to really try to help you guys out as much as we possibly can. So first of all, I want to introduce Dr. Marion Blank, who we are so lucky to have with us today. She is one of the world experts in reading and also in autism. And she developed the Reading Kingdom. She's written all kinds of books and articles on reading. And she has actually a reading program for children with autism as well. And she wrote The Spectacular Bond, a wonderful book, also on reaching and teaching children with autism. So Dr. Marion, thank you for being here today.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
We're
as
happy.
Always. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Well, we love having you. All right, so we're going to get started. Let's just start talking about some of the most common questions around dyslexia. And I guess I'll start with, what are the signs of dyslexia? What should parents be looking for?
Well, before answering that, let me make some introductory comments, and I may come back to this because it's such a critical point. Okay. It's the whole diagnosis of dyslexia. Until fairly recently, dyslexia was confined to basically, it's there in the first phrase, unexpected problems in reading. So in other words, you had a child who was in all other respects perfectly normal, often very bright, and you'd never suspect that they would have reading problems, and they had severe reading problems. And this was picked up actually by a physician in England about his own child, and he wrote about it. And so the diagnosis of dyslexia was very rare. If there was any reason to suspect a reading problem for any reason, if the child came from poverty background, if the child had some early signs of brain damage, if the child had some severe oral language problems, if they were automatically not dyslexics. Well, some of that was sort of crazy because basically you couldn't be lower class and have a dyslexia problem, because you could always say, well, he's lower class, he's coming from poverty background, he's impoverished, that's why he's dyslexic. In recent years, this has changed, and it's changed for, I won't go into all the reasons, but it's changed so that we even have the experts in the field, experts from major universities like Yale, claiming that 30% of the population might be dyslexic. Now, from any logical point of view about a syndrome, any syndrome, no syndrome exists in that numbers. No, the only time a syndrome exists in that numbers is if you have an environmental factor causing it. For example, if you, and there were communities like this, I think one was in China, where there was no iodine in the water supply, you end up with huge number of medical problems, but these were not inherent in the child, they were the result of environmental forces. There is no neurological condition, whether it is even autism, which is now considered to be epidemic, occurs in no more than 3% of the population. So it is quite astounding when people say you have 30% of the population being dyslexic. And people are not questioning this because there's a certain glamour now to the concept of dyslexia. Now in England, then we'll get to the symptoms, but in England, and I'm also going to get to the punchline, there is no test known to mankind currently that distinguishes a poor reader from a dyslexic. And nobody is making that statement. Parents are very upset when their child is a poor reader. They are not upset when their child is dyslexic. For some reason, that is what has happened. So parents fight for a dyslexia diagnosis. And the thing is, it really doesn't matter. So I'm going to be anticipating what I'm saying in a little while. It really doesn't matter, because guess what? The solution is always the same. It doesn't matter if your child's a poor reader. It doesn't matter if your child's dyslexic. They're all going to be told, or that your advice for all will be, teach them phonics. And since phonics didn't work because those children are taught phonics, you have to double or triple treat them with phonics. So it's, you take the diagnosis, and one of the really tragic things is that the testing for dyslexia is very expensive. It costs school districts a fortune. And since you know the outcome before the test is completed, there is absolutely no point in testing for dyslexia, because it doesn't matter what the cause of the reading problem is, the answer will be use phonics. And the answer is, well, phonics failed, well, use double the rate of phonics, or use triple the rate of phonics. So we're in a very wild, and some of these comments may be upsetting because parents feel very strong. Many parents have spent thousands of dollars to get a diagnosis of dyslexia, but the treatment is going to be exactly the same if they had paid $0. So let's start out with that as the start, because it really is unfortunately, a very serious problem in the country, that there is no different treatment for dyslexia than there is for any other reading difficulty, and all the treatments are not effective. So now, what do you see in dyslexia? They used to say that the children see backwards, and so they used to make jokes about if your life is full of melons, you're dyslexic, meaning instead of if your life is full of lemons, you're, the old phrase. So it's that the sequence of letters is not adhered to. The words may move around on the paper. There are a lot of children who have reading problems who complain about this. And in some cases, there are treatments, and there are eye therapy treatments, which you can look up online, which can be helpful to some students. including certain types of glasses and so on. But the visual problems are often noted, and they're important. One of the outstanding problems is inconsistent or very poor spelling. And what happens is even that the poor spelling is often inconsistent. So one day, let's say the child writes water, W-A-W-T-E-R, but the next day he'll write it as W-O-E-T-E-R. And so they are basically holding no visual memory for words. And so the words change. Now, one of there is a comment that often, and this was definitely the case years ago when the diagnosis was much more restrictive, is that they would be quite good with spoken language. So if you gave them, sorry for that noise, it'll go. So if you gave them instructions orally, they would get that, but they have difficulty with it when it's written down. Another sign is difficulty carrying out a sequence of directions, and also very much like children with attention deficit disorder, and often those two go together, is struggling with planning and organization. One of the interesting things about children with ADD is that they often are good readers, but very poor spellers, because spelling requires an attention to detail that the children don't have. Now, one of the things I do believe, even though you can't prove it, and there's no evidence on it, that there is a difference between dyslexia, which is very rare, and poor reading. And one of the, I'll give you, the reason I wrote the HTE, I remember working with a boy whose IQ was about 160, extraordinarily bright, and very motivated, and a super bright, super well-functioning kid. And I asked him, but he couldn't read. He was in first grade. And I asked him to write the word the, and he wrote HTE. And the reason I mention that is the HT does not exist in English as a beginning set of letters for a word. There is no word in English that starts with HT. And so whereas the is the most common word in the language, you see thousands of examples of the compared to anything else, any other word. There's no word in English that compares to the, and yet this child who was so bright had no visual memory for the. And so that always stuck with me. And that boy was very dyslexic. And but as I said before, there is no available test currently. That doesn't mean it won't change in the next year or 10 years or whatever, but there is no test currently available today that distinguishes dyslexia from any other reading difficulty.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep. All right. So let's talk a little bit about some of the misconceptions around dyslexia.
So this is,
yes.
Most kids, I guess we need an S in there. Most kids who can't read, sorry for that.
Yes, we do.
Most kids who can't read are dyslexic. That is the common statement today. It's not true. 30 to 40% of kids are dyslexic. I said before, there is no known entity which exists in that kind of numbers based on neurological considerations. There are, for example, unfortunately, poverty goes in those numbers, but poverty is not a genetic condition. It's an environmental condition. In general, the rate of reading failure in poverty groups in the United States is of the order of 60 to 70%. Prisoners, for example, who have very high rates of reading failure, are generally thought that 85% of them can't read. So the numbers of non-readers or poor readers in the United States is astronomically high. And because of the difficulties of English, it's much higher than in any other type of language. The general view today is if someone is a poor reader, they're dyslexic. Now, there was for a while, and it's come back, an idea that okay, if you're dyslexic, it's unfortunate, but you're really super skilled in some other way. And very often, for example, artists are dyslexic. They have this great visual sense about the art world, and they can't look at the visual print world well. In actual fact, when they've done studies on it, people who are dyslexic do not fare well in life. They do not have alternative gifts. They could, some of them do, but as a general population, dyslexia is not a gift. But I've mentioned that this is a theme that keeps running through a lot of American work, and I may have mentioned this in a previous talk. I've done it in other situations. There was a famous cartoonist about 30 or 40 years ago called Jules Pfeiffer. And he did a cartoon of big executives sitting around the table saying, oh, this pollution problem is terrible. What can we do? And someone comes up with an idea and say, no, that won't work. And someone comes up with another idea. No, that won't work. And then someone says, I got it. Pollution is good for you. And they said, yes, that's the way to go. And that's basically what we've done. We've sort of come across with the message, dyslexia is good for you. You may not be able to read, but you got some other fabulous talents. That also has not stood to the test of time.
Right.
Okay.
And what about dyslexia just around the world in general?
Okay. It depends on the language you're studying, but in general, on many of the major, there's no country in the world, no developed country in the world. And we're not going to compare this to Chinese, which is a whole other issue where other factors are involved in the reading failure, if there is reading failure. But in general, around the world, the rates of dyslexia are 1 to 5%. So why doesn't someone just get up and say, why are people suggesting in the United States it's up to 30 to 40%, and in the rest of the world it's 1 to 5%? So what the answer to that has been is, well, the rest of the world really does have the same rates. It's just their language is more transparent is the word, that they can get away with phonics, but English is not, excuse me, English is not transparent. And that's the reason we have so much dyslexia, which is a crazy way of looking at things. I mean, in Italy, for example, the rate of dyslexia is between 1 to 5%. In Spain, for example, they've done study, within a month, kids are decoding. And the reason they're easily, a month of instruction, and that doesn't mean they're comprehending, that's a different issue. But in terms of decoding, which is the big problem in dyslexia, these kids are doing beautifully within a month. And the reason is that the sound symbol correspondences are totally consistent. And in addition, there's a huge advantage in a language like Spanish, because basically it's not each letter isn't sounded out. You basically sound it out as a unit based on the syllable structure. So what happens is you can take a word, let's say like word agua. So you don't do a, g, u, a. You know that ag goes together as ag, agua, ag. So what happens is in English, that's not possible, because every letter in English can have 5, 6, 7 different pronunciations. So you can't put the letter with another letter and say this is consistent. In other words, for example, in English, A has about 8 or 9 different sounds. Mm-hmm. You can do a word like aura, A-U-R-A. Where do you get the aura? I mean, everybody says A is a. And then you've got the long A, and then you've got the A where it's at the beginning of words like adjust. Suddenly it's an So you've got 8 or 9 different sounds, and the link to the consonant that comes next is not at all clear. So you can't do a simple sound symbol relationship as you can in a language like Spanish. So Spanish, as I said, the kids get it within a few weeks. The decoding, and Italian is the same. The Romance languages in general are the same. The number of exceptions are rare, whereas in English, when the kids are taught rules, and that's how children are taught here, because not only is the sound symbol thing complicated. It is that you then have to put on a variety of rules to explain why it isn't a simple sound symbol relationship. So take the very common rule, practically everybody knows, the silent E rule. So you take a word like cake and you say, oh, there's an E at the end of it. So that means you don't sound out the E, it's silent. So suddenly this letter disappears. But what you've got to do is go back into the word, find a vowel that's there and make it long. So bake, for example, which would be bake if you sound it out, becomes bake. Now that would be nice if that rule worked, but then you get a word like come, C-O-M-E, it's not comb, it's come. You get a word like done, D-O-N-E, it's not done, it's not done, it's done. So there isn't one, this is sort of sad, and poor kids are forced to learn these rules. There isn't one rule in English that doesn't have exceptions. Mm-hmm. So the interesting thing is this debate, do we need 300 rules or 600 rules to learn up to third grade reading? But even if it's 300 rules, which is even if it's 60 rules, it's a lot, which some people say is possible, not one of those rules is consistent. So the kid puts in tremendous amounts of time and effort into being told to learn these rules. Of course, when they're reading on their own, they don't do it. And so then they're totally left as lost when they have to read on their own. And basically, we have given the children a system that doesn't work, and we say, learn it, because this is the way to learn English.
Yeah. Okay. And yeah, and so I guess the question is, how would you know if your child was a true dyslexic, if we could figure out what that exactly is, or, you know, neurologically, or just a poor reader?
Yeah, well, in England for many years, this was a very big distinction. Michael Rudder, who was a leader in the field, made that distinction, oh, I don't know, quite enough, maybe 50, 60 years ago. And but nowadays it's been ripped to shreds because all the criteria that used to be necessary for dyslexia has been abandoned. For example, no child from poverty could be described as dyslexic because you had another reason to attribute the poor reading. You had another reason that you could attribute the poor reading to. So, and for example, no child who had a speech impediment could be considered dyslexic because that also ruled out dyslexia. We know that children with oral language problems are very prone, not always, but are very prone to written language problems. So that was a criterion. If a child had an oral language problem of any sort, they could not be defined as dyslexic. That has all been thrown out. And basically, people are making a ton of money. School districts are paying a fortune, and the taxpayer is bearing that, to diagnose dyslexia. So the child goes often through 2 days of long testing. And in the end, guess what? You're going to be told use phonics. Mm-hmm. It's an absolutely irrational process that's going on.
So I just want to, let's get into why, I guess, some of the different issues, such as visual sequencing and how that works. And
well, now we're going to go into some of the issues. It doesn't matter what the cause, why the child is a poor reader. Just let's look at what's happening in the poor reading. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that has been, now for years, dyslexia was considered a visual problem. We now know that it really links to language problems. So it's not visual, it's more auditory. But one of the things that has not been looked at is the unique role of the visual processes in reading. In the natural world, aside from reading, we never use sequencing as a means of identification. They have done tons and tons of good studies on the scanning that people do when they get into a situation. For example, if a live, an animate being is in a situation, that's the first thing you look at. Why? Biologically, it makes sense. Because that's something that could be helpful or harmful to you. So your body says, look at whether the being if there's a being in the picture, see if it's animate. Another thing is size will matter. There's a ton of research, anybody could look this up online, of the visual processes in everyday visual processing, where you're looking at the world and how do you scan for big things? How do you scan for small things? How do you scan for something you know versus something that's unfamiliar? I mean, there's tons of studies. Many of them are very interesting and they're worth reading if you like doing reading research, research on visual scanning. But the thing about reading that is absolutely, reading and numbers, is that for the first time, visual sequencing matters. It never matters anywhere else. So for example, if you saw the fruits on your left and you say, what do you see here? People would say some fruits, or I see an apple and some other fruits. And if you then change the sequence and said to people, what do you see here? They'd say, I see the same thing. Why are you asking me that dumb question? I mean, you just showed me those fruits. So visual sequencing never matters in the regular world, in the ordinary world. And suddenly it becomes absolutely critical in reading. So reading requires a type of visual processing that is never required in life. In fact, it's something that the child learned from the first month of life. Ignore. You don't say, oh, I'm not gonna pick up that paper because it's facing to the left. Oh, no, I'm not gonna touch it. If you face it to the right, maybe I'll touch it. Visual sequencing or the arrangement, the visual order never matters in life. And suddenly, whatever age finally reading comes in, 4 years of age, 5 years of age, 6 years of age, you suddenly say to the child, hey, you know what? You never noticed this dimension. In fact, you would have been very silly to notice this dimension, but suddenly you have to notice this dimension, which is, this is a total aside, but guess which group of kids is very good at this? Children with autism, because they don't look at the visual world in the same way as children who are neurotypical. So that if they look, they're not noticing all kinds of features visually in terms of the emotional meaning of the vision and so on. Instead, they are much more likely to look at features that children who are neurotypical don't look for. And so that's why in autism, there's a very interesting phenomena associated called hyperlexia. There are many children with autism who can do exactly what dyslexics can't do. They can do amazingly well at decoding because they now have to pay attention to a dimension that feels very good to the child with autism. It's a dimension that neurotypical children specifically ignore. It's a dimension that the child with autism says, oh, that's meat and potatoes for me. I love it. So it's really fascinating that children with autism have these super decoding skills, which is called hyperlexia. Mm-hmm. So the issue is that left to right sequencing is never taught. Many years ago, I was giving a lecture on this, and a woman came over to me at the end of the lecture, and she said, you know, I had a very severe stroke a number of years back, and I lost my ability to read. And she said, and no one could tell me what to do. And she said, then finally, one day, I figured out that left to right sequencing mattered in it. And as soon as I figured that out, I was able to read again. And so no one even looks to see if this is a problem, but it is a very major problem. The nice thing is, it's something that is so easy to teach that there is absolutely no reason for this problem. In Reading Kingdom, we do a lot of teaching of this. There are other ways to do it, and people can ask questions about it. But basically, if you do it well, within 4 to 6 weeks, a child has totally mastered the visual sequencing of reading. It's a skill that's never taught. And there's a very famous neurophysiologist who talks about the importance of teaching phonics. And he says, well, there's another problem in reading. It's visual sequencing, but there's no way to teach it. And I have no idea why he said that. I've been meaning to write to him for a number of years because it's something that can easily be taught.
And it's, you have that in the Reading Kingdom program.
Absolutely, we have it in there.
Okay. All right.
Now,
yeah.
There's another I'm sorry, did you want to ask something?
No. Go ahead. Go ahead.
One of the interesting things is it's not just the sequencing. You also have to remember the sequence. Now, years ago, this is before the cell phone. Years ago, for example, if you said to people, even now you could do it on your phone if you want. If you said to people, what letters go with the number 1 on a phone? Or what letters go with the number 7 on a phone? And people will have done this thousands and thousands and thousands of times. And they'll say, well, I don't know which letters go with the number 7. I don't know. And now people may be taking out their cell phones and looking. But it's because you always have the visual there. There's no need to put it into memory. So to the degree that sequences, like number sequences, existed in our world, you never had to memorize them. So there were very few sequences. Some did exist, but there was absolutely no reason to use any brain cells to store it because you had it there. You don't have to say, oh my God, what goes with number 5? I don't remember. Now, the problem in reading is you suddenly have to remember these sequences. Again, it's a skill that you learn to ignore all your life. And so you must get training in this. The good news, again, is that it's not hard to train, but it has to be trained. Now, I'll give you an example now for the people who are good readers, and some of the people who are here are not good readers. If you look at the word that's next to the bottom there, it's just the one above the last point, Reading Kingdom includes. If you go to that word, it's on a spelling test. It happens to be a real word. And if you say to people, tell me what this word is, just pronounce it. They say synodochi, sindachi. No one is ready to sound it out. But now, if you're a good reader, and I tell you what it is, and I come back to you next year, and hopefully the pandemic is over and we can all enjoy ourselves, I come back to you and I say, well, I show this, or I'll say, what is it? If you're a good reader, even though you only saw it one time in your life, you're going to be able to tell me what it is. And if you're a poor reader, you're going to need 40 to 50 trials before you know how to say the word. I'll tell you what the word is. It's synecdoche. So if I say to you now, and in fact, you can try it yourself, put it on a card, put it away, and in a few months, look at it and say, what is that? Oh yeah, sure, it's synecdoche. Once a good reader learns a word in one trial. And that's why phonics seems to work, because it doesn't matter what you do in that one trial. If you do anything semi-decent, a good reader will learn it, because that's the good reader has developed the visual memory skills and retains them, the visual skills needed for reading. Poor readers need very careful training in that, and no program that I know of other than Reading Kingdom offers that. Okay, here's a little test for yourself. Make a card, put it away, and in a few months' time, go and look for it and say, gee, what was the pronunciation of that word?
I remembered it because you told it to me before. So I did remember it this time.
You always remember it if you're a good reader. That's what the visual memory skills of good readers are amazing.
Yeah.
I'll just mention a study that was done a number of years ago in Canada. It was really amazing study. What they did was they took good readers, college students, and they gave them hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of various authors. So you were given Jane Austen, somebody else was given Shakespeare, somebody else was given, I don't know, some other famous author. So you just did books of that author.
Mhm.
Then they went back several months. And by the way, this is very interesting. They gave it to them in different visual arrangements. So they gave it left to right or mirror image or upside down. It took, guess how fast it takes a good reader 6 weeks to adjust to a totally different system. In other words, within 6 weeks, they can read backwards as fast as they could read forwards. The
Wow.
visual system in individual well-functioning read is just amazing. And then they went back and they showed the person pages from the author they had read and pages that they had not read from the same author. So they gave, if it was Jane Austen, they gave them the Jane Austen, a page from Jane Austen that they had read, and then they gave a page from Jane Austen that they had not read. And they said to him, do you recognize this page? I said, no, I did so many hundreds of pages. Of course I don't recognize it. Guess what? The page they had read, whatever, several months before, they read faster than the new page from the same author. Our visual memory is amazing when you're a good reader. Mm-hmm. And so the visual training is absolutely critical. Good readers pick it up automatically. That's the sense of what a good reader does. Readers who have some difficulty just need some training in it. It's a few weeks of training. Absolutely nobody thinks about it because vision was tossed out as an important dimension a number of years back, and no one does any real training in visual sequencing or visual memory. Now, did you want to ask something?
I changed slides that this was we were looking at this, that this is a educational program for teachers, yeah. And you can see what it's all about.
Yeah, and I just want to mention this because just to give the history, what happened was phonics has been failing for 200 years. We know that Ben Franklin wrote articles against phonics because he was a printer and he was very concerned with these issues. So what happened was about 50 years ago, maybe 40 years ago, the phonics people said, you know, maybe phonics is really unpopular because we need certain skills before phonics so that the kids can do phonics. And what they did was turn to Russian research on what was called phonological awareness or phonological training.
Yeah.
And what they did was, so it's tasks like, here's the word bus. If we change the B to a T, what will it become? Tus, you know, that kind of thing. So you're not doing any reading, you're just doing sound analysis. And the Russians had a big move on in this direction. And what the people in phonics did said, oh my God, that's the reason we didn't do phonological training on the kids. So now today, what is happening in schools is children get 2 to 3 years of training in phonological awareness or phonological analysis on the grounds that this is the basis for reading. What it has served as, and we can go through the criteria, but what it has served as is an excuse for phonics to fail, because now it isn't until 2nd or 3rd grade that you say, well, why aren't the kids reading? I mean, we did phonological analysis now for 2 years, and they're not reading, and they say, oh, well, phonics wasn't taught right. So phonological awareness has been a delaying tactic, which allows the people who teach phonics to say, oh, well, we're not failing because we're not doing enough phonological awareness training. And huge amounts of time are now spent in classes and in homework and in everything else related to it in teaching phonological awareness, where the child is not doing reading, he's analyzing or she's analyzing the sound patterns of words. So for example, and this is why teachers are being told this, so distinguish the difference between phonological awareness and phonemic awareness. I'm not going to go into that. It has to do with analyzing sounds. But a lot of work is done on that. So for example, you may have a child, he has to come home and he say, how many syllables, because you're going to analyze sounds now, how many syllables in water? Water. Oh, 2 syllables, right. How many syllables in hope? Oh, 1 syllable. And how many syllables in continent? Continent, 3 syllables. So they're doing, that's not they have dozens of tasks in that realm. I'm just giving you examples of it. And so what the teacher is told to discriminate, blend, segment, and manipulate sounds. Hours and hours and hours of training, none of which lead to reading. And the interest, now, they do say that good readers are very good at phonological awareness. But good readers are good at a lot of things. And that doesn't mean that that's the cause of their reading success. But the reasoning has been, well, if the good readers do that, if we teach the poor readers to do it, they'll be reading well. Our reading scores, despite 30 to 40 years of phonological awareness, have not improved at all. Okay. So you're going to see your child going through a lot of this training. Now, the treatment for all children with reading, the main treatment, they'll do a few other things, but the main treatment is phonics. And one of the things, so for example, and this is a worksheet that I think you picked it out, Karen.
It
right?
was from a phonic, yeah, it's from a dyslexic book workbook. Yeah.
Yeah. So did he kick the ball in the net? And is that a K or a CK? Now, actually, if you ever want to confuse a child who's already in difficulty, is give them two very similar looking things and put them together, and you then ensure failure. So a sheet like this is saying to the child, you know what, just in case you had a problem, we'd like to reinforce it and make the problem worse. Because this does not teach. Now, there's no logic to the fact that K and CK in English both make the K sound. There's absolute, what you've got to do is develop the visual memory where a child looks and say, K-I-K, no, that doesn't make, no, it's not. K-I-C-K, yeah, that feels right. You've got to get the feel that something feels right. And this kind of worksheet doesn't do that. Now, the other thing that happens, and this is what this worksheet depicts, is the child does thousands of isolated word analysis. This is, it never reading is never isolated word analysis. Reading is sustained reading of sequential, logically related, coherent ideas. And these worksheets, where one sentence has nothing to do with the next, and the next sentence has nothing to do with what preceded it, set the child up for not understanding how to comprehend reading. So these worksheets are recipes for disaster. And the producers of these worksheets make a fortune. Finances are a huge factor in what children are presented with. And what they're presented with is, unfortunately, just what they don't need.
Yeah, I'm going to get to this so we can start talking about treatment, because I want to get to questions too.
Okay, well,
So,
basically,
yeah,
this just reinforces, I don't have to go into it, this reinforces the kind of skills that are not taught in a current reading education. I've mentioned the sequencing. Motor skills are particularly important. Motor skills today in children in the United States are seriously falling behind, because the children do less and less and less fine motor activity. And the motor, what you want is the child to be able to write smoothly and easily by hand. It's fine to do computer writing, but you really also want handwriting, which has been shown to be much more effective in helping children retain words. And the visual motor skills of sequencing the letters and so on are very important too. For example, even a skill like going from the end of the right-hand side of the page to the beginning of the left-hand side of the page for the next sentence, like if a sentence is put over two lines, that kind of skill is never taught. It's another important skill for many children with learning difficulties. So what you're seeing is that the skills are just not taught. And so it's no big, and the skills that are taught, like the phonics sheet we just showed, are actually very misleading. There is a reason why our reading scores are so disastrous. It's not a big issue. It's not a hard thing to decipher. Okay. So my recommended treatment is what I've developed in Reading Kingdom. that first of all, this is just to highlight an idea that has just been given very little consideration, but which is absolutely central. In English, we have two main word classes, and one is non-content words. These are the words that seem to not refer to anything, like it and was and so and if. So they're called non-content, but they're only non-content if you put them out of context. That's why. Here's a sentence here. If it is to be, it is up to me. That, and in that very simple sentence, all composed of two-letter words, it is very meaningful. You can't, not one of those words is meaningful on its own. You put it together, it's meaningful. So now what's very interesting, and people have not paid attention to it, is number one, these words are processed in a different part of the brain from the content words, the words that are refer to things like house and car and television and so on. They're processed in a different part of the brain, and they make up about 60% of any page of text that you will ever see in your life, except the phonics worksheets. So what happens is, and there are only 200 of them in the language and only 100 that matter, because little kids don't have to know heretofore and whence and thence and so on. Those 100 words occupy about 60% of every page of text. So here's an interesting idea. By teaching you're not going to teach just only those words, but by teaching 100 words, you give a child automatic mastery of the majority of any page of text he'll ever see. And that's one of the key principles of the Reading Kingdom.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay.
Yep. And
okay.
then, yeah, talk about
okay.
a little bit about connectors. And
yes.
Yes.
And this is really important. This is something that has to be and is totally ignored in phonics instruction, because you can't make very connected sentences when you're focused on phonics. So what happens is, here's a workbook from 1995, but you can take a current workbook. Bill has a soft bed. And the reason Bill has a soft bed is, for some reason, these people decided to teach the word be, which isn't even in that many words, but they do it. Now, in the next sentence, Bob has a big belt. Now, if you met somebody in the street and he says, Bill has a soft bed and Bob has a big belt, you would think he's crazy, because people do not talk like that. And people do. And so what the phonics books present children with is disconnected text that is absolutely meaningless and is designed supposedly to teach sound patterns, but this doesn't teach the letter B or the sound B particularly well. And it does a lot of other things wrong, but this is what children have for months and months and months of instruction. Now, the reason I just put this in is, here is a sentence, here's a little bit of text from a real book. It's The Pied Piper, which was a famous book years ago. People don't know it today, but this is a connected text. Hamlin was a lovely town. Well, if you assert that something is a lovely town, you expect to hear something about the town. And sure enough, it had pretty little houses and cobblestone streets. In other words, once you have a real idea, you have certain expectations about what's going to follow. Phonics texts violate those expectations. Phonics texts violate natural language totally. And the child, now, so what's going here is, and it was next to a great wide river. And so this is nice. And then it says, but, and that's why but is so important, because but says, something's different, but Hamlin had a problem. And so now you're going to expect to hear something about the problem. If the next sentence was that Bill had a bud, you would say, what? This doesn't make sense. And so what we do is give the children in phonics meaningless sentence after meaningless sentence after meaningless sentence, and then we're surprised that the comprehension scores in America are even worse than the decoding scores.
Mm-hmm. So as part of the Reading Kingdom program, connected sentences, that's part of the whole curriculum.
It's absolutely critical at every point.
Yeah.
And within 3 to 4 weeks, children are reading books with connected text. It's not the flowing language of everyday speech, because that would make it too hard. But yes, we do connect that. If you don't use connected text, you are not going to be able to teach reading.
Okay. And then just talk a little bit about the effects of reading failure on children.
This is a very interesting issue. First of all, in the United States, the pressure has been, we must start teaching reading as early as possible because that'll prevent the failure. In actual fact, in the Scandinavian countries, at least some of them, they don't start teaching reading till age 7. And that allows you to work with a much more mature child who has many fewer problems. They are even able to deal with some of the bad teaching more effectively because they just have a much more solid understanding of language. So they specifically avoid teaching reading too early. I personally think that's a wonderful solution, but you're not going to be able to do it in the United States because parents are told from age 4 on, do phonics, do sound analysis, make your child rhyme words, and so on. So we haven't even tried as an experiment allowing children to learn other things about language and holding off the teaching of decoding of reading until 7. I personally think it would be a great thing to try, but it's not going to be on the agenda in this country.
Okay.
Now, the other thing that is really important is that given what we can now do with computers, that is a much better way of teaching initial reading. If you have a group situation, yeah, the good readers will do well, but the good readers do well anyway. It doesn't matter if you're doing the group situation or a one-to-one or a big group or a small group. But the point is, if a child has problems learning in a group, learning initial reading in a group is one of the worst things you can do. Because what happens is the teacher will hold up a letter and say, what sound is this? The kid who can do it does it. The kid who can't do it says, I don't know why he picked that sound and I sure can't connect it. And I don't know. You can't follow group instruction. A child with a reading problem cannot follow group instruction. So it is a waste of time to have the group instruction. But we have computers where the teaching can be totally individualized if the program is a good one.
Right. Right. And in fact, I will say, because I do it, I want to get to the questions, a couple of things. First of all, for those of you who are Testing Mom members, we have Dr. Blank's program, Reading Kingdom, as part of Testing Mom, and you it can go in and use it anytime. And this teaches initial reading just the way you were talking about, which is it's completely individualized to the child. It only gives them lessons on what they need. It evaluates where they are. That's right. I mean, and it teaches all the things that you were just talking about, which is why I'm always sending parents to Reading Kingdom. Always, I recommend it all the time.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, well, it's such a good program and it really works. And that's why I love it. And she also has Story Smarts, which is a comprehension program, and then Spelling Ninja. These are all fun programs for kids. And they really work. And I think, as you said, if you put your child on Reading Kingdom, especially a younger, early reader, you'll know fairly soon if it's going to work for your child, if they use it for how long? A couple of weeks, would you say?
No, I would give it about 6 weeks.
6 weeks,
which
okay.
is pretty, which is it's not nothing. It's not nothing, if you can say that. But you'll know pretty soon. And and by 6 weeks, one of the things that happens is the child really begins to feel successful. And once you have that, one of the things that is absolutely not considered, there are very few articles on it in reading instruction, is the issue of failure. If the child starts failing, he gives up or she gives up, and you must prevent the reading failure.
Exactly. And then, of course, I wanted to just mention, if anyone would like to do one-to-one tutoring, that's something you can get at Testing Mom. And here, if you are interested in that, we do have teachers, reading teachers, if you would like to work your child to work one-on-one with a tutor, and just reach out to us at tutoring@testingmom.com. And then here's the number as well, and you can give us a call. But I want to get to also people's questions. And there's a lot of them. So let me just dive right in to a couple.
Sure.
One is, let's see, a lot of the dyslexia programs involve using multisensory activities. What do you do for a child who cannot process more than one type of sensory input at a time? For example, my son cannot look at a word and then tap out the letters at the same time on his arm or trace in sand. Do you know of that?
Yeah, I mean, though there's no data that this is needed. There's no data that, so these are all the ancillary tasks that I talked about that you've got to now do sound analysis or letter analysis in a variety of ways. But there's no grounds to say that this is going to help. Now, if you have to do it, we would have to, in other words, just to meet the requirements of a school program and stuff, I help parents do that, but it's not because it's needed. It's because in order to let the child survive in school, he has to do it.
Can someone who has low expressive receptive language skills still be diagnosed with dyslexia, or does there have to be a large discrepancy between language and reading skills?
That's a question that's sort of past and present. Currently, no. Currently, anyone can be diagnosed with dyslexia, and parents are fighting for that diagnosis on the grounds that they think it's better than hearing poor reading. But they've basically thrown away all the criteria that used to be needed to be called dyslexic. So it's really not worth discussing, because the treatment is going to be exactly the same, whether they have a diagnosis of poor reading or dyslexia.
So one of the questions is it worth it to, do you think, to spend the money to have a child tested for dyslexia, or is that not important? Do you think you should just maybe jump right into, just if you have a child who seems to have trouble with reading, try a reading kingdom and see if it's going to make it.
That's what I would suggest.
Before you spend the money.
Yeah, and unless there's an unusual situation. Okay. I don't want to go into, occasionally there are it's really interesting. I think I've mentioned this in a previous talk. I was called into a school because this child did mirror writing, and meaning he wrote everything backwards, and very well. I mean, he was as if he had put a mirror to a word and wrote it that way. And I asked him to read, he read beautifully. I asked him to write, he wrote beautifully. I said, why do you do it the other way? He says, it's more interesting. Oh. So he was bored with early reading, because it is pretty boring. And he was good with visual stuff. And to entertain himself, he developed mirror writing. But it wasn't that he couldn't read. He read beautifully. He read above grade level. So there are interesting cases, and there could be interesting exceptions. But in the main, it is absolutely not worth doing the testing. It costs a fortune, and you're going to be told, you know what, let's change it. If you say to the person, if my child is found to have dyslexia, are you going to recommend phonics? And if they say absolutely, then don't bother with the testing, because you've got the answer. It isn't like, oh, well, instead of doing phonics, we'll do whole language, or we'll do something. Yeah. So just ask that question. Are you going to recommend anything other than phonics? And if they say no, you say, fine, then I don't need to do the testing.
Okay. Someone is asking if dyslexic children are often artistic, since they don't have a visual memory for words. Do they tend to be artistic, or do they struggle with art, or is there any connection?
Well, there are some connections, but they haven't been studied well. So I'd rather not give a firm answer on that. It is, many artists will report that they are dyslexic. And that makes sense in the sense, because the artist sees the visual world very differently than from what is needed for reading. But the average or the typical child who cannot read is not an artist. So that's a very select group.
Okay. For children with severe hyperlexia, how do you go about treating their struggles with comprehension issues?
You use Reading Kingdom because that's how it's been built. And you use Story Smarts and Steps to Stories. Steps, if they have really comprehension difficulties, it's really good to do Steps to Stories, which is on the ASD Reading website.
Right.
And then to go into Story Smarts. And it really is, in general, can be very effective.
And so if a child has hyperlexia, you would recommend ASD reading, which is your program?
Probably, not knowing anything else, yeah, I'd probably do that.
Probably, okay.
I'd certainly go to ASD Reading for Steps to Stories.
Okay.
Because anybody can do Steps to Stories, you know.
It's another program that
it's not computerized. It's a paper and pencil with artwork, right. But it's very easy to implement and it's very effective.
How is the visualizing and verbalizing program from Linda Mood Bell different from visual sequence training that we do in Reading Kingdom? Do you know the Linda?
Yeah. The thing is that, and I haven't looked at it in a long time, but what they do is a very demanding analysis of sound patterns based on mouth movements. So it's very expensive. It takes hours and hours of training, where you say to the child, okay, is this a lip popper or is this a something else? Like P is a lip popper because you have to pop your lips for pup, you know what I mean? And so they'll give a child a word and then he has to analyze it into all its various components that have been labeled with kind of cutesy terms. And so it's a much slowed down process of phonological awareness. And it's very demanding and very expensive. So, and I haven't seen the latest iterations, so it may have changed, but that's the one I knew. And that in general, again, it makes, now for children who have articulation problems, it is brutal. So, and many children with reading problems have articulation problems. So, because if you sort of say, which part of your mouth did you use? Did you touch your teeth? Did you touch your tongue? Did your tongue do? That is like poison for kids with articulation problems. Whereas if you develop good visual memory skills, they don't need the articulation analysis at all. Because, for example, if they can't hear the difference between, if they can't handle the difference between a word like cat and cap, if they learn to see the difference, it is much easier than doing this very intricate sound. Where did you put your tongue for cat? And where did you put your tongue for cap? And that kind of, so you're doing this very complicated analysis, which doesn't translate easily into reading anyway. But if you develop the visual skill properly, you've given the child a very powerful way to discriminate between words, because you now see the difference between the words that you didn't hear the difference. Okay.
Okay. If we are just learning about Reading Kingdom for the first time, and it's a K-3 program, my son is 8.5 years old. He's going to be starting 4th grade. Do you start at the kindergarten level or at the grade 3 level? And do you go more quickly through things than you would if your child was in kindergarten?
It totally depends on the child. In other words, he goes into the task, he goes into the program, and if he needs the program, we'll tell you. We'll say, you know, there's certain criteria, and if he doesn't need it, we'll say, no, you don't need it. But we have, and it depends what, from the question, it seems that the person is focused on decoding. But if it's a comprehension issue, that's a very different issue. And on Reading Kingdom is a more advanced version, paper and pencil, for the higher level post 3rd grade reading. So just look at the Reading Kingdom site and decide which you want. And the thing is, if you go into Reading Kingdom It doesn't matter what age your child is. If it shows that he doesn't have the reading and decoding skills for second grade, he'll be put through that program. But the nice thing is anything he knows, he'll skip. In other words, for example, we teach each word individually. And if we hold up a word or show a word and ask the child to do certain things, and he shows that he knows it, we don't teach it. So you can skip lots and lots of material in Reading Kingdom if your child has it already. So you can get through the program very quickly.
And there's a lot more questions than we're going to have time for, so I'm kind of going to skip around a little bit. But what is the recommended time frame for Reading Kingdom? Like 30 minutes a day or one lesson?
It'll vary. Generally, it'll be between 15 and 20 minutes. But the other thing is you can do 2 lessons a day if the child's willing to. It's better if you give a break in between of at least a half an hour, but you can do much more if you want. So the time demands are really minimal compared to phonics instruction, which takes hours and hours and hours of drill and homework and so on.
And can you give some examples of visual sequencing activities and visual memory sequencing activities? Like, what do you mean by that? Like when you talk about—
Well, it's on the Reading Kingdom site, but for example, we will have the child, let's say you show, this is just an example, but let's say there's the word is watch, W-A-T-C-H, and you then show it. It's one of the tasks. It's interesting. What we do, for example, is show several instances of words like that have letters missing. So let's say the watch has W-T-H, and some others have W-A-T, and what we say first to the child is find the word that can become watch, so that he has to visualize, because it's not there on the screens. He's got to look and say, no, if I do. So we do a lot of visualization that requires the sequencing. And then once he's picked the word, we then say, now complete it. Now, if he puts it in wrong, it won't accept it. So he has to do it correctly. Now, if a parent is interested, they can design tests like that at home. They don't have to use the program. It's just a lot of work to design these tests, but that's what we've tried to do for you. But basically, it is cleverly designing the test without ever discussing the skill you're teaching. You don't say to the child, well, really now we want you to look at this word and memorize it. We just set it up that they have to memorize it. And if they don't, they have to redo it until they do memorize it and so on. So it's setting up the teaching to ensure that you get the result without demanding any verbal rules that are so onerous for children.
Okay. We don't have time for everything, so I'm just going to ask one more question because we actually are over our time. But someone is asking if you're familiar with the Orson-Gillingham approach.
Orson-Gillingham.
Yeah. What do you think? What are your thoughts? That's a question.
What was the question? I'm sorry.
What are your thoughts on its rate of success? Or do you know a lot about it? Yeah.
It is brutally painful for children who have reading problems. It is taking a child who cannot do phonological processing and saying, you know what, you can't do it, so let's do it 25 times more. It is a brutally painful process, and it does very little good work on comprehension. But it's considered to be the great program for children who have reading difficulties. It is, but you ask the children what they think. I mean, they shudder with fear when you bring them that material. It's painful. I mean, it's like taking a child who has major motor problems and saying, you know what? I think I'm going to get you to climb the Alps today. I think that's really what you need. Let's do some Alp training. And that's what Orson-Gillingham does. It takes what the child can't do and it says, let's do it. Definitely. It's torture.
Okay. Well, it seems to me that it's worth, for anybody who has a struggling reader, it's definitely worth giving Reading Kingdom a try, and no matter what. And I have seen it with our parents where kids have been behind in reading. They've used the program and they have really caught up and made huge strides. So I recommend giving it a try no matter what. And it's less expensive than maybe a lot of other programs that are out there. Okay, and then and the last question, because I know what the answer is, but I want you to say it. Does Reading Kingdom help struggling readers with autism?
We have a version of the program called ASD Reading, and the reason it's different is I had one parent. It's somewhat more expensive than Reading Kingdom, and I had one parent who, with a child with autism, who chose it because it was cheaper. But I have designed ASD Reading to teach language skills that the child with autism doesn't have. So it's very hard to explain in the website all the skills that you want to teach because there are so many important ones. But basically, it's a very, very successful way of teaching. It is different enough. For example, in Reading Kingdom, if a child knows a word, we skip it. I never do that with children with autism. They do much better if you go slowly, even if you can push them. It isn't worth pushing them because they get very nervous. So there are a lot of principles that are not discussed. They're discussed by various books and so on, but they are all adhered to in the program. So ASD Reading, and in general, children with very severe language difficulties who aren't autistic also do better with ASD Reading, because it's designed to take account of the very sensitive learning issues that these children have.
Thank you. And I just want to say thank you for being here tonight and shedding some light on this. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to everybody's questions, but I hope that you learned something new tonight. And I just really appreciate everybody being here. And I appreciate you, Dr. Marion, for sharing your knowledge with us tonight. So thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Okay.
Maybe we'll see each other again soon.
We'll do it again.
Yeah, we'll do it again.
Topic. Okay. All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.